Welcome to the Regenaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Griggs. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Griggs, and I'm the host of the Regenaissance Podcast. And today, alongside me, I have Joe Ailts of Ailts Agronomy. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, glad to be here.
So, to get started, I know I mentioned right before this started that for my podcast so far, I've primarily had farmers and ranchers on my podcast. But one of my biggest goals of my whole company is essentially painting the full picture of agriculture because there's so much that goes into it all. And so I would just love to hear, your background and what led you to starting out agronomy.
Yeah, sure. Happy to give you some background there. I like to say that I was born with a green thumb, a competitive spirit, and an insatiable curiosity for knowledge. And when you pull that into a blender, blend it up, and what you get out of that is this urge to grow competitive giant pumpkins. And so, kind of a weird segue we're going to get into right out of the gate here, but I'll bring it back to agronomy, I promise. So, you combine those three qualities, and what it leads you to do is just want to be the best you can possibly be by growing things. And so I've spent the last 20 some years of my life trying to grow these competitive giant pumpkins. In doing so, because this hobby is so focused on maximizing every variable as it relates to plants and conditions and soils and such, you really become quite self-taught in how to do these things correctly. You do a lot of reading and you do a lot of self-investigation. It's led me down 1,000 different rabbit holes. We were using biologicals as applied microorganisms way back in the early 2000s. Here we are in 2025, and they're just making their big foray into row crop agriculture. But this competitive giant pumpkin growing hobby was really my entree into the world of agriculture. From there, it was just kind of a natural fit to find which type of position in agriculture would be the best fit. Scientifically wired out of the gate, got a degree in biotech from a local university here, and continue to expand my learnings. Where that's landed me is just absolutely love soil health. I love soil biology. I love trying to unlock the mysteries that happens in cropping systems to help us hack these systems for maximizing productivity and trying to do less damage in the process. So it's a unique spectrum of producers I work with. I get to cover everybody in the spectrum between conventional agriculture and full-on regen. And when I'm not playing agronomist by day, I like to say that by weekends, nights, and holidays, we run a regenerative pumpkin and sweet corn farm here in our own family 3 acres. So lots to keep me busy. Got my own little playground to figure some stuff out, and we take that out to the row crop production acres to see how can we implement more soil health practices to improve their productivity and hopefully do something better for the land in the process.
So before going into the actual consultancy with the work, would love to actually talk about soil biology because I'm trying to even remember if I've really talked about the actual soil biology. And I know you talk about the rise of fear a lot on Twitter. So what exactly is going on in the soil biology? I know that's a very basic question, but I don't even think I've talked about that yet on this podcast.
It's such a great question, and it's such a complex answer. It's hard to even know where to start. Here's my big picture takeaway. I think there's an incredible amount of secrets to be unlocked in the soil biology sphere that will help us grow plants better with less inputs, with more productivity, more of the good things. And I think we as silly humans have only scratched the surface of this complexity of what goes on beneath our feet. But as we continue to learn more and more about which microbes are down there, what these microbes are doing, how they're interfacing with plant roots, it's becoming more and more aware for us in the consultancy space to say, how can we use some of these things that nature's already designed, figure out a way to leverage them on our behalf, and then produce better crops as a result of that. I guess that's the big overarching picture, personal take that I have on that. When we try to dive into the weeds, I guess the next step from there is what can we measure in soil, both chemistry, physically, as well as biological. What do we have good tests for, and then what do we think we can manage if we get a test result that we think we mean something. As a scientifically minded agronomist, one of the things that I really emphasize in my business and here on our own farm is what tools do I have to measure things? And what can I do with those measurements to put them into work that ultimately result in a better outcome for us? Again, that's an overarching big picture type of a sentiment here. But what we see now happening in this space of soil biology is a lot more tests coming online from various types of laboratories to say, hey, we can measure this. You guys go figure out what this means and what to do with it. So it's really exciting time for that. And I've certainly grasped onto a few different testing platforms in the industry that I think do give us some insight that we can take and go, yeah, that's neat. I think we can do something with that.
And then I guess to continue on with that too, because the I guess the most interesting part for me whenever I first, when I started working on a farm back in 2022, and I remember seeing just giant earthworms. And then I remember that took me back to my childhood of just seeing earthworms as a kid. You never really think much about that. And then you start to learn that that's actually a good sign for soil. And then really trying to understand what's actually happening beneath the ground, and the fact that I forgot what the saying is like a teaspoon of soil, it's like a billion microorganisms. Is that
Somewhere in that
correct?
neighborhood. Yeah, I think the most recent one I've seen is a tablespoon contains 10 billion. So I did the math on that. Interesting. I said, okay, if a tablespoon contains 10 billion, I asked Grok AI, I said, how many microbes in an acre furrow slice? And if you're not familiar, an acre furrow slice would be 6 inches of soil across 4,300, 560 square feet. You're talking like into the hundreds of trillions of microbes in an acre furrow slice of ground. That's a few bugs. That's quite a few bugs.
Wow. So then I guess can we talk about the soil food web too? Because I know that's something probably most listeners have never heard of, for like nematodes and protozoas, and how all of that is just interconnected, and how if one part of that system is not in sync, then above ground showcases that. So I would just love to talk on that too.
Yeah, so the soil food web is a fascinating concept. Makes perfect sense. And pretty much what it boils down to is that the smaller you are as an organism, the more you serve as food for those above you. I guess probably the easiest way to understand that. So everything eats everything else, right? In a kind of scaling downward. I would love for us to be able to unlock more secrets of the intricacies of this soil food web, because there again, I think, as I stated earlier, herein lie the secrets of how we can leverage what nature has designed and put that to work for us for building better plants. My goal as someone who's involved in soil health and trying to improve the quality of the soils we work with is to say, since I don't really understand the full degree of all these connections between the various types of microbes and critters and bugs that are down there, the assumption is that if we have more of them, that's probably a good thing. Now, there's good guys, there's neutral guys, and there's bad guys. And so if you say you want more of them, you're going to get more of all those things. But under the premise that there's probably more good and neutral guys than there are bad guys, I still think that this overarching premise that the more of these things we have in soils, the better off the soils are for plant productivity. And I think we've seen that as well. We know that things like organic matter and soil respiration and some of these other metrics that we can assess soil by tend to be more productive. And then I think it's not too far of a stretch to say that when you have higher soil respiration, more CO2 coming out of the soil, you have more microbes there. And so that really kind of helps somewhat validate the concept that having more microbes in the soil, a more robust soil food web, if you will, is better in the long run for all aspects of agriculture, that being soil health, that being crop productivity, for the land, the environment, all the things. So we like more microbes doing more things there because we just think that's a good thing.
So then going on to the actual research and work you've done with farms and ranches, can you, I guess, give an example of, because I'm just curious to hear what this process is like. If you just have an example of just working with a farm and actually doing all the testing and the results, and then how do you go about once you start that process of finding the results? I'm just curious how this whole process is.
Yeah, sure. So, someone who's interested in soil microbiology, operating from the assumption that more microbes produce better crops, we've tried applying this in various farm scenarios in the area that I work. The best example I can cite, and this is the one that I shared on the John Kemp podcast recently too, I have a specific interest in a certain species of microbe called mycorrhizal fungi. And as the name implies, this is a species of fungi that exist universally, ubiquitously in all agriculture systems, as well as any other type of plant environments. These mycorrhizal fungi are a collection of species that create mutually beneficial relationships with plant roots. And in fact, many plants simply just don't do well. They cannot thrive without associations with these beneficial microbes in the ground. So they're literally quite everywhere. And I think over 90% of all plant species on the planet will interact with some form of mycorrhiza. And the 10% that don't tend to be the brassica family. That's debatable. There's more research about that in another rabbit hole. But generally speaking, the brassica family, things like broccolis and cabbages and horseradish roots and other types of crucifers typically don't play nice with these mycorrhiza. Anyways, to scoot this forward, what I have done is I have taken this mycorrhiza, which you can buy in a bag on a shelf, and I've coated seeds, corn and soybean seeds, with a dry seed treatment containing this mycorrhiza. When we plant this into environments where we think we have low populations, we have found that there is indeed a robust response in crop productivity by doing that. Again, it comes back to this assumption that if you bring more of the good guys to the table and you can help facilitate the relationships between these soil microbes and crops, you're going to get a better outcome as a result of that. And that's exactly what my data has shown over the last 3 years. Using a quality mycorrhiza preparation, we have found that that does indeed lead to meaningful increase in yield in those environments.
The mycorrhizal fungi is so fascinating to me because that's whenever I also started learning how trees can communicate with one another, and the fact that you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but if I recall correctly, that they can communicate with a dying tree too and try to send resources below to try to save that tree. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, I've read the book on that as well. Absolutely fascinating. There certainly does seem to be a communication network established underground between trees of like species and even differing species. And it has been proposed that the telephone wire, the soup can shoestring, if you will, is indeed this mycorrhizal network, where essentially it's one organism. This giant mycorrhizal web is a single giant organism, and because it is plugged into all these different trees in a certain geographical range, the assumption is that then messages can be communicated from one tree through the mycorrhizal network to another. I think it's absolutely fascinating that nature's designed a system to do that. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the largest living organism ever identified is a mycorrhizal network in a grove of aspen trees. I think somewhere out in the west, what Colorado, somewhere over the mountain ranges. That is the largest physical organism that's been identified by researchers, a mycorrhizal network.
Do you know how large it was? Because I feel like
Uh,
that has to be huge.
yeah, I'm thinking we're on the order of many, many, many square acres, maybe even on the order of square miles at that point.
Oh my gosh. I'm curious then with because this was actually I know this is not exactly on topic, but this was one of the first things that made me really start thinking about God because this was again in 2022 and I just remember working on the farm and seeing just being out on the land and nature, but then also once I started learning about the fungi in particular, it made me start really thinking about if it was God's design. And so I'm just curious, do you believe in God or a God or gods?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought the conversation down this road because not many folks are willing to do that. I absolutely do. And I'd say so from a scientific skeptic's perspective who spent his whole life asking the big questions: where do we come from? How do we get here? The more I dive into the complexity of biological systems, the more I have appreciation for, in fact, that there is a creator above who created all of this. The complexity is just mind blowing. Whether you're looking at it from a biological level underneath a microscope and how the DNA sequences had to come together to do what creates a living organism, to the largest scale, in how galaxies and the universe is constructed, there leaves no question in my mind that there is a creator who had to put this system together. You just can't use random chance to get to this point. Not in my mind, anyways.
I agree. Well, because I just remember whenever I was working on that farm, and again, this was the genuinely the most unexpected thing that ever happened in my life because what led me to even start thinking about all this was my brother's death and then eventually my mother's too. But I just remember working on that farm and then thinking how that was pretty much the thing I noticed the most in common with all farmers and ranchers was they believed in some type of God or were some type of faith or religion. And it makes a lot of sense when actually you're out there and seeing it all in person and actually start thinking about it. And then the more I think about the fungi in particular and just what goes under the soil, it just genuinely blows my mind because you can't see what's going on unless you do some digging and then start looking under a microscope. But whenever you kind of zoom out and see the system at play, and then you see whenever you make small changes or improvements to how that actually fixes the system or inverse, whenever you think of like conventional ag, whenever you do something that destroys the land or soil, then the negative consequences come out of that. And you see that with soil fertility and then plant health and then the health of the animals and for us. And so it's just interesting how the whole system is just interconnected with all of that. And that's why I had to ask just because it's something that I continue to notice as I talk to more people in the space of agriculture.
Yeah, and I think that's an incredibly astute observation on your behalf, and certainly one that resonates with me. When we go out there and we look at the way in which we are adapting our systems now in the regenerative space, I think it needs to be pointed out that oftentimes these changes we're making are getting back to the way nature designed the system. Whether you call it nature, whether you call it God, or all the above, in which it is. When we're doing the soil health principles, things like leaving cover on the land and always having a living root and having animals walk across there. I mean, this is the way this system was designed. And for us silly humans to think we can come in here and force change that isn't in line with the way the system has originally been designed, obviously it leads us to a dead end, in which case we just then end up throwing it in a reverse gear, backing up and going back to the way that nature had figured it out with our own little human adaptation spin on that in order to make productive crops.
Now, I'm curious whenever talking to farmers and ranchers, especially, I'm just curious too, in terms of the conversations, because one thing I know we mentioned this before the call too is if we're wanting to move, towards regenerative moving forward, and a lot of agriculture has been doing it a different way for such a long time, it needs to be collaborative because we cannot silo them even more and make them the scapegoat and saying they're destroying the land, they're destroying the health of everything, and they're worsening food for us. That's literally the last thing we can do, because that will just silo them even more and not want to help or do any changes at all to their operation. So whenever you're talking to them, I'm curious, do I'm trying to figure out how to best phrase this. How have you been able to have, I guess, collaborative, conversations with folks and having them, have an open ear to what you're talking about and wanting to share?
Yeah, that's an incredible question, and certainly a challenge I think any of us in this space are up against on a regular basis. It's an interesting situation I operate in with this innate passion for soil health. There's not a whole lot of colleagues up here in Northwest Wisconsin that are doing the independent agronomy thing with a soil health spin on it. So, as I mentioned to you earlier, it's both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing that when you're the only guy, because anybody who's looking for this is going to find the only guy who's doing it. It's a curse because I would love to have more colleagues with whom I can share ideas and bounce things off of, and just really collaborate in the way you're describing, such that all ships rise with the tide. So we're in a really interesting, very fragmented market in this regen world, where you have a couple of pioneers out there, farmers and ranchers, who are saying, I need to do something different. I would love to build a team around me that can help me, do this the right way. There's going to be mistakes made along the way as well, but that's really hard to do, especially when there's so few of us out here doing that. So I don't know if I have any answers other than to say that as someone who is insatiably curious about this topic, I'm constantly on the hunt for others who are doing these types of things and trying to take their practices and learnings and then put them to use with the folks that I'm working with. I guess the way that these conversations happen at the farm level, I'm very open about my soil health principles when I start working with these farms, and maybe a little bit about the demographics of my business. I work with farmers who are very conventional oriented and are never going to plant a cover crop in their life, to all the way on the opposite side of the spectrum where they're trying to make the transition from conventional all the way into fully regen, and everything in between, of course. I see it as my own personal mission to figure out, find people where they're at, and then pull them along that spectrum as long as they're willing and able to do so. And so the way in which those conversations typically take place, the easiest thing to do is, get them to consider growing some cover crops. If they're in a corn bean rotation, hey, soybeans have come off here in September, early October. You still got some growing window. There might be a program that helps offset the cost of putting the seed in the ground. How about you try planting some cereal rye? Let's see what that does. Well, why would I want to do that? Well, as someone who spends a lot of time focusing on soil health, I can tell you, when you put that carbon pump into the ground in late September, you're now going to be adding more to that soil that you could otherwise by leaving it fallow. And it's pretty low risk. Yes, there's some costs associated with that. However, if we want to make this ground more productive over time, I do believe that putting cover crops in this rotation can help you achieve that goal. That is the easiest way for me to sell some of these regenerative principles for a farm that has not yet dipped their toe into this water. And I don't find that there's a lot of hesitation to that. There's still a long ways to go, of course, in getting our row crop farmers to plant covers across the Corn Belt. But that type of conversation is an easy one for me to have. And I've had great success in getting folks to adopt those very simple principles. Once that ball starts rolling, then again, I'll pull out the tests that I have at my disposal to come out and measure those things. we'll do things like cover crop biomass test, or we'll perform a Haney soil health test. And I'm looking for ways to use these measurements to show them, hey, as a result of doing this, you've now changed this metric, and this metric. And I think that's good for crops overall. So that's a pretty brief overview of how a conversation like that might take place. And again, I'm just not finding a whole lot of resistance to having those types of conversations. Maybe it's a function of the fact that up here in Northwest Wisconsin, because we have such a tight growing window, these farmers have to be open-minded on how to improve their systems. We've got from May 1st until the late September to get our crops produced. And in such a short time window, we need to maximize every variable to take advantage of that short growing season. So perhaps that lends to some open mindedness to try some things that are a little bit different outside the boundaries of the norm. And having done so, we can say with degree of certainty that these things are improving systems overall. I having a great time watching how cover crops have been able to prove in productivity in our systems.
I guess how does cover crops improve the system?
Sure. Very simply, if we spend 6 months out of the year without any living root in the soil, that's an incredible opportunity to do something that has benefit. Well, what is that benefit? Carbon pumps. That's what plants do, right? They collect sunlight. They use that energy to take carbon dioxide and turn that into sugar. Then they send that sugar, a portion of that sugar, into the ground to feed microbes. And when microbes are fed, they do what microbes do, which is reproduce and then exude other substances that can be plant beneficial. So pretty straightforward. I'm sure it's 1,000x more complicated than what I just described. But at the surface, if we can create more opportunity to capture more sunlight, which is Jay Fuhr's famous quote, the guy who came up with the soil health principles, capture more sunlight, we pump more carbon into the soil. And we believe that pumping more carbon into the soil is better for the system overall.
Now I'm curious to continue when talking to conventional farmers too, because you're saying haven't really met with much resistance. I'm curious then is for these folks why they've never say for example why they've never tried cover cropping. Is it just because they're just doing what they've always been taught growing up, and I'm just curious as to why. I'm trying to figure out how to best phrase this now too, because that's interesting that you said that you're laying it out there saying that over time you're improving the soil, so therefore you're improving everything for your system. Because I'm trying to find ways to again talk to conventional farmers and get the open ear to just having conversations and collaborative conversations. From your experience, is just the fact that it's just because they've been doing the farming the certain way their whole lives and that's how they were raised? Or why do you think they were so receptive to hearing what you had to say? I know you mentioned that the small planting window too, but I wonder if it's just because also farming is quite segmented in itself too. And so like you're saying, I mean, even for your example, you're saying it's just you, so you're not even able to collaborate with anyone on your team.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I think you hit some of the points spot on. There's just a general lack of education capability out there. It's not that farmers are unwilling. It's just that perhaps no one's ever talked to them about that in a way where they can see the benefit of doing so. You've also got the situation where most of the agronomy information that a farmer is going to receive is usually coming through a vendor that's also trying to sell them a product, whether that's a co-op that sells fertilizer and chemistry, or a seed guy selling seed, or a biological guy trying to sell biologicals. Oftentimes the information, which very well could be solid education information, is usually always colored by some sort of sales bias as well. And the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of the farmers, at least up in this part of the world, they do not work with independent consultants. And so again, this comes back to this island that I feel like I live on. As much as I enjoy the opportunity to work with these folks, there's so many farms out there who are just not tapping into the resources of an independent consultant that does not bring product sales bias to the table. Couple that with another factor is that there's not a whole lot of financial incentive in doing cover crops, at least from a retail standpoint. So if you're a co-op agronomist or you're a seed guy, there's just not a lot of money to be made in this arena. And so without a financial incentive behind it, a significant one, it's just not something that gets talked about. It's much easier to sell a bag of seed or a chemistry program or another couple tons of fertilizer than it is to try to convince a farmer to bring in a small grain as a cover crop into the rotation. So I think that that's part of the equation there into understanding why there has been such slow uptake of some of these principles, especially as it relates to cover cropping, is just a lack of quality education getting in front of these farmers to have these types of conversations. Incredible opportunity for me as well, obviously, but there's just not enough of me out there doing that to create this wide scale adoption.
And then for conventional farmers too, I'm just curious from your experience talking to them, how do they go about, their operation? Are they going for max is it for just max yield and max efficiency of, say, an acre of corn? Or what's the goal whenever they're planting for that? I'm assuming it's trying to get as much yield as possible of good quality corn.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I would say that there are two primary goals any farm is trying to achieve. The first of which is profitability, of course. Got to feed the family and hope to farm again next year. And then secondarily, I find that there are many farms out there who are going to prioritize yield above all else as well, where maybe profitability isn't as much of a concern because they're in a position to do so. I think that a third goal that should be getting much more weight in these types of conversations is, can I leave this land in better shape than what I acquired it as? That to me is, I think, should be at the table in terms of profitability and productivity as well, because ultimately we need to have reason to believe that our land can continue to be as productive as it has been historically. And we know that conventional farming practices have eroded the ability to maximize yield potential over time. Now, granted, when we look at the yield curves for corn and soybeans over the last 100 years, they're up and to the right. So obviously, not all is lost. Through genetic breeding and improved practices and a whole bunch of other things, we continue to see yield on a national scale rise over time. So something is working out there. But at the same time, I think we can have improvements in yield while soil health is declining. And that's part of it. Part of what needs to be the conversation is to say, okay, how else are we going to prioritize maintaining our soil health? Because I firmly believe, and maybe I'm a bit biased, that if we do steps to improve soil health, we can achieve both higher profitability and productivity. It's kind of a cake and eat it scenario. We need better tools to help manage that. I'll certainly admit that, but I also believe there's enough tools at our disposal with cover cropping and soil health principles and in some of the other things going on, that we can have all three in concert with one another.
Want to talk on chemical sprays, because that is another really talked about. It's still not talked about enough, in my opinion, too, because there's so much in this world of fungicides, herbicides, insecticides, and pesticides, and especially right now with glyphosate and how a lot of states are pushing for complete immunity for Bayer, to where you cannot sue them for any potential litigation on glyphosate, and they actually were just ordered to pay $2.1 billion in a settlement case in Georgia, and they currently have 60,000 live cases. Now, the topic of that with soil health, and then also talking with or working with the conventional farmers, I guess I'm trying to think because how to start with all of this, because there's just so much in the world of, again, chemical sprays, and all of them are for different use cases. From your research and then working with these farms, I'm assuming that they use sprays. How does this impacting the soil health?
Sure. Obviously, a very controversial question and one with no easy answers. The use of herbicides is a bittersweet necessity. Unless we have better tools at our disposal that are much easily adapted and put to use, we're stuck with using herbicides to manage weeds. My personal take on that is, yeah, unfortunately, we have to use them until better options exist. Do those options exist? Yeah, they do, but it takes a heck of a lot of gumption and commitment to put those to use. A lot more hard work in order to create a system where you can get by without those. So let me briefly explain that. I think Rick Clark, regenerative farmer in Indiana, is probably the best example of a guy who's figured out how to remove this from his system. So as a truly regenerative organic program, what he's doing down there, he is, number one, kicked all of the sprays off the farm, and number two, done so without using tillage. And so, let me back up and say that there's two ways to control weeds. You can spray them with an herbicide or you can till them, right? And if you want to do what is best for soil health, you do neither of those things. But if you do neither of those things, then how do we manage the weeds? That's really the crux of this difficult argument, is that for most guys out there who are farming row crops, you have to use one or both of these options in order to control the weeds. How has Rick gotten around that? Well, he has figured out a way to use these cover crops that we previously discussed to be the weed control for them. So it comes with a lot of difficulty. I mean, it's a challenge to figure out how to set your system up that you can use smother cover crops as smother crops to keep the weed suppressed. There's ways to do it. We do it here on our little regenerative farm. It's how we grow pumpkins in a rye system where we don't need to use weed sprays in order to control the weeds. So there is a way to do it, but it just requires a lot of hard work to get there. And I'm not so sure that a lot of the farmers who are conventionally growing right now are willing to make those changes because of the amount of effort it takes to do that. But there's light at the end of the tunnel. Like I said, we can do this. There's ways to do it. I just don't know how fast and how far we can scale this up to the point where we can say, yep, we can grow crops without using herbicides. It's a long ways out.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I brought this up is from the consumer standpoint, they, especially online, harp a lot about chemical sprays. But again, they have never worked on a farm. A lot of them still have never visited a farm or talked to a farmer or rancher. And so it's way easier for them, from their viewpoint, from a major city, to spew that and not realize how little people are actually in farming and ranching, how difficult it is. And from a financial standpoint, how awful it is right now, especially in today's climate. And so there's trade offs with everything. And I'm not trying to say it's right or wrong, but it's the reality of everything. And folks have yet to really grasp that. And it's very frustrating from my perspective because now, as time's moving on, this whole Maha movement and everything, which is great, but people gain a little awareness and then they stop listening and then they just start spewing. And I'm trying as hard as I can to push back to all that because they don't realize that it's just siloing even more and fragmenting the conventional side from everyone else. And so that's why my hope is as we continue to have more discussions to where folks can take a step back and continue to listen. Because it's great that the folks are lashing on to regenerative agriculture as a whole, knowing where your food comes from. But it's just like all of a sudden it only took 1 month and now they're the experts too. And that's kind of the most frustrating aspect of all of this, above all else, is the fact that um, people are not willing to listen, and I can't. I'm not sure why. That's what I'm trying to really figure out. That's what I've been figuring out for the last this whole year. Actually, it's been great for the whole Maha stuff, but it's the same problems continue to perpetuate itself, and most still have no idea how bad our food system is, especially when you think long term and the big picture of it all. We're not in a good spot
Sure.
at all, and yeah, I'm just gonna leave it at that. And that's why I'm having these conversations. Is we desperately need to have these constantly, or else I don't know if what we want to have happen in the future will happen.
Well, I can offer a glimmer of hope there. I think everything you said is exactly spot on, and there does seem to be a lot of back and forth, smashing heads and such on these topics. But here's a glimmer of hope, and the hope I want to offer is that there are ways for us to take baby steps to evolve folks in the farming world from using heavy intense herbicide sprays to less intense herbicide sprays. And I would call that improvement, right? We can't overnight snap our fingers and have everybody doing Rick Clark regen organic. It's just not going to work that way,
Yeah.
right? It's unrealistic expectation. However, we can all make baby steps towards that direction. So here's the glimmer of hope I want to give you. Rodrigo Worley is UW Wisconsin weed scientist who's been doing incredible work on using cereal rye as a cover to produce non-GMO soybeans. So that's a mouthful, but let me break that down. So Wisconsin's actually a pretty significant producer of non-GMO soybeans. If you're not familiar with the concept, these are soybeans that have no genetically modified aspect to their DNA, which means you cannot use weed sprays to control weeds. For example, well, you can. There are some chemistries you can use. We'll talk about that in a second, but typically they don't have the Roundup gene in them. So you're not spraying Roundup genes. Or I'm sorry, you're not spraying Roundup spray in these beans because they don't have the gene to process that, right? So a lot of these beans get shipped overseas. Japan's a huge market for the non-GMO soybean market, but I would expect that there would be a domestic use for this as well, especially as interest in using these types of feedstocks continues to grow. So in this non-GMO soybean system, what Rodrigo at UW has identified is that you can plant cereal rye after the prior year's corn harvest, allow that cereal rye to reach its close to maturity at the end of May here in Wisconsin. You knock it down with a roller crimper, which then creates this incredible weed suppressive mat. Essentially, it's a bed of straw that you come back and plant these non-GMO soybeans into. Because this betta straw is so thick, you can get by with using much less chemistry to grow these beans. In fact, you're getting upwards of 80 to 90% weed coverage control in this type of system because the rye cover crop does the work for you. This is how we make baby steps towards reducing the use of pesticides across the landscape. Incrementally, if we can convince more folks that are growing soybeans to consider using a cover crop rye situation, the UW has essentially proven the system can work, and it can work quite effectively. So, having been involved with a few producers who are dabbling in this, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we use the cover crop system here to produce pumpkins. We do know that there are simple steps that can be taken without saying overnight my whole operation's got to flip into this whole type of regen practice format, to say we can take steps in this direction to start to reduce the amount of chemistry needed and still produce respectable yields that will end up feeding our populations.
And I'm curious then, in terms of like the worst and better, because I know again glyphosate is the one that's talked about the most, and there's atrazine, but then there are far worse chemicals that people really aren't aware of. But then there's also, I'm assuming, less toxic chemicals. So I'm just curious, I guess, where does, from your perspective, glyphosate stand at?
Yeah, fair question. I'm not sure I've ever created a hierarchy in my mind of toxicity of these herbicides. I'm not sure we really know. I mean, I guess if you want to do the research on it, you go read the LD50 and you figure out how much would I need to drink to kill off 50% of the population. That's probably the easiest and most straightforward way to rank something on its toxicity. But beyond that, I don't know if anybody really has a grasp of how these chemistries are affecting things like soil microbes, subsequent crops and rotational intervals, and other factors that are well beyond our comprehension. It's just not a good way. And I don't think these studies have been done to kind of force rank things in terms of environmental toxicity. I think I'm just operating from the premise to say, hey, are there other ways that we can employ practices soil health wise where we can just take more of these out of the equation. So, just to give the listeners some practical numbers to work with, in a typical soybean rotation, you're using upwards of 3 chemistries on the first pass, and then you come back and you hit them again a second time later on the season with an additional 3 chemistries. That's a pretty common soybean herbicide rotation around here. So if you've got 6 total chemistries going into a tank mix over the course of an entire growing season, if we could even pull out 1 or 2 of those, you're talking 20-30% reduction in total chemistry load. That's a big deal to me. And I'm optimistic that with some of these soil health principles and the incorporation of covers, we might be able to start practically pulling out 1 or 2 of these chemistries in some of these passes. And that becomes meaningful reduction when you spread this out across the vast acres where these crops are grown.
I love that. And that's again the thing that I love about agriculture too is it forces you to think long term in the big picture. And yeah, that's to me just why I like that, because we as humanity have really lost that. We expect everything. I mean, that's the problem with agriculture too. Is people are expecting all of this really fast. I noticed that with the whole tallow craze that's huge right now. Is the fact that now it's good to demand transparency, and it's good that they want restaurants to quote unquote switch to tallow, but then they want 100% grass fed and finished regeneratively raised tallow. But then you see that our inventory of cattle is the lowest since the 50s, and that the fact that if we were to add more cattle, then you've got to wait an additional 2 years for grass fed and finished. And so a lot of that has been completely missed. But that's where the collaboration and sharing information online comes into play. The one thing I've been so surprised about, I actually tweeted this yesterday, is the fact that I've not seen a major debate on. It doesn't even have to be somebody that works at Bayer. It could just be someone that's advocating for glyphosate or sprays versus someone that's not. I'm surprised that we've just never really seen that, because I feel like that could play huge in terms of just communicating and going further with the collaboration. It's just the fact that that conversation's really never been had at just like a big stage.
I saw that message you posted and I almost replied, but maybe this is a great forum to have that discussion because I can actually have a bit of this debate. So that internal debates exist inside my head. as an agronomist who is helping farmers trying to manage weeds, I struggle with that internally. So I've got the angel and the demon fighting on my shoulders. That one that says glyphosate is the best grass killer known to man, hands down. There's nothing more effective at killing grasses that you don't want in a field than glyphosate. On the other side of me, you've got all of the, the information that says, well, this thing might be potentially cancerous and toxic, and there's big lawsuits now being awarded based on that. What's fact, what's fiction, I don't know. But there's an internal debate inside my head saying, is this good? Is this bad? Again, it's necessary evil, right? We need ways to control grasses and crops. Otherwise, we can't yield. And if we can't yield, we can't feed the animals. If we can't feed the animals, we can't feed the humans. That's just the way this works. And I think there's some of that nuance gets lost when people take a polarized side of this debate, either strongly for or against the use of it, is that we have to consider the nuance in this equation where, if we can't kill the weeds, we suffer loss. That's just fact. Yes, there are ways, as I've already described, that we can control weeds without the use of glyphosate, but that really requires a big, big change that is like turning the Titanic. That's not something we can all snap our fingers and make happen overnight. Now, if a governmental regulatory agency said, sorry, glyphosate's gone, bye bye, we would have to figure out a way to pivot that Titanic overnight and get really creative. But I don't foresee that happening because of the impact that that would have on American farmers and scrambling to find ways to control weeds. If that were to happen, we would see probably some pretty significant real reductions overnight in that particular season's crops. In which case, you have to wonder, would we produce enough grain in order to feed the animals and to feed the humans and feed the fuel industries that are relying on consistent production year over year? So I don't really have a strong take on which side of that debate I land on, other than I know that it's incredibly nuanced. And before anybody takes a polarized position on one side of that, I think it's important to recognize that there are valid arguments on both sides of it that need to be considered before we can have a healthy debate about that.
Agreed. And that's why, because one thing that I see from pro glyphosate, for example, is the fact that if, say, they were to ban it overnight, then our food system's toast. And I can see that in a lot of ways because farms that manage thousands and thousands of acres, again, a consumer has no idea what that's like for a farmer at all. I've worked on farming and I still have no idea what that's like. And and so that's just really challenging in an already challenging industry, especially when you talk from finances, because it is awful for most farmers across the board. And the system that's in place is not great either. There needs to be a lot of changes with that, and then again, those changes require a lot of time and patience, and it's just a very messy situation all across the board. So I guess my next question then, moving on to, I guess for someone who's never done any soil testing on their operation or homestead, what would you recommend them to do, to really start thinking about the actual land that they're stewarding, and that thinking about soil fertility? I guess, yeah, what would be your recommendations for them to start?
Yeah, great question. Glad to answer that one. Getting into the things that really get me excited about being an agronomist. For someone who's never done soil testing on their farm or their garden before, I love contrast. Contrast tells really important stories. So when coming up with a plan for how to do soil sampling for folks that have never done it before, I would encourage them to consider trying to figure out two very disparate farming environments from which to sample from. So if you're a farmer that's farming a bunch of acres, go sample your sandiest, lightest ground, and then go sample some of your best ground, and just look at the differences that emerge in those two tests. Likewise, if you're a gardener, same principle applies. Find the best area or the best bed that you have, sample it, and then go sample something that's not very well performing, or even if that's your yard, for example, because the numbers will probably show you some pretty stark contrast. And then you can create associations in your own mind between numbers on this test and the productivity of that respective land. And once you create those associations, you understand, have a framework or a baseline to compare against. You go, oh, maybe if I fine tune this dial here, there's an opportunity to bring up the productivity of that chunk that just hasn't performed next to this really good stuff, which seems to be performing well up here. So that would be my initial way to approach that. And I love grabbing the worst performing chunk of acres on a farm and saying, let's figure out why this isn't performing. And a soil test is usually the easiest way to do that. More often than not, I would say 7 or 8 times out of 10, the answers are going to be right there on that lab test. This comes back and says, guess what? You need to fix this. And if you do, there's a reasonable chance that you're going to see increased productivity there that's more akin to some of the better performing acres on the farm.
So to continue with that conversation too, and just talking more on cover crops as a whole too. So say a person, they did the soil testing and have all the results too. In terms of, figuring out which cover crops to implement, how would you go about that process too? Is that also based upon where you're at geographically and all of that? I guess what are some things that you have to consider too, with elements of nature and all that?
Sure. Geography plays a big role in cover crop selection. We're fairly limited up here in Northwest Wisconsin because of the short growing season I've already alluded to, in which case, really the only cover crop that has a good chance of doing much work for us is cereal rye. And that's just because it's bulletproof when it comes to winter and cold tolerance. We can plant that at the end of September, early October. It might freeze a week later, and we can still expect cover crop rye to grow either later on in that season or come back to life early next spring. So it is the most versatile, most commonly used cover crop in our neck of the woods. However, if folks start putting small grain into their rotations, things like wheat or barley or rye itself, those are typically harvested the last week in July or early August in our neck of the woods. And so, if that is done, then that entirely opens up a window of opportunity to do so much more creative fun with cover crops. Because when you've got the entire month of August and most of September to grow something, again, it opens up the slate to in helping select a lot more species. I am particularly interested in the use of legumes blended with grasses following a small grain harvest as a way to potentially fix nitrogen in front of the following year's corn crop. Again, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, nature's designed amazing systems. If we can just figure out how to respect them and put them to use, we can grow our own fertilizer. And so a legume established in early August in northern Wisconsin will go on to produce what I think is a meaningful amount of nitrogen in its biomass that could potentially be taken as a credit for next year's corn nitrogen program. I know that there are breeders working at the USDA Forage Research Center in southern Wisconsin that have looked at breeding cover crop species specifically for winter hardiness so that we can achieve this goal. You've got species like hairy vetch and other forms of clovers and even winter peas that are going to be becoming more and more winter hardy and can withstand the types of climatic conditions here in Wisconsin that usually were not very amenable to growing these species before. So super exciting to think that we can possibly grow a bunch of nitrogen following a small grain harvest in front of next year's corn that could be credited back to that system. To continue to expand on that, yeah, we can use cool things like tillage radishes and turnips and other types of deep taprooted covers to help break up compaction layers and increase the biodiversity. And that's other hot topic that's being discussed in these regenerative circles now is what is the impact of using many more families and species of cover crops in these rotations, because there is a belief that these serve as unique hosts for different types of soil microbes that offer unique benefits as well. So I don't know, it's all very complex, and there's a domino effect that I'm describing here that we don't fully understand. But the more diverse species you can bring into crop rotations builds more diverse communities of microbes that do good things for crops. I guess is really the easiest way to say that. We don't fully understand what that is, of course. These are things we notice. And so trying to get as many families and species into these rotations of cover crops has really been quite beneficial. But we're challenged up here in Northwest Wisconsin for all the reasons I cited. It's one of the unique aspects of this, though, and looking for hacks to the system is how can we change that? Are there things we can do as farmers or agronomists to take the time that we are given, hack the system a bit, and maybe find a way to squeeze in something other than cereal rye? So one of the areas of focus that I've been working on in my agronomy business is the concept that we can plant early soybeans that mature much earlier than what we would normally plant here without giving up meaningful yield. And because of that, we can harvest them earlier. And if we can harvest them earlier, that means there's more window established cover crops that could be more diverse. And so what we're looking at up here in northern Wisconsin is that if we plant a bean that is 10 days earlier harvest, 10 days in late September is a big deal for us up here. It might be the difference between establishment and nothing at all. And so my data has shown that we can get away with planting these early maturity soybeans without giving up significant yield. Grab yourself another 10 days of potential cover crop establishment. And then again, that opens up the window to doing all kinds of fun, unique things that we couldn't otherwise do.
And then in terms of growing your own nitrogen, because I know you mentioned that, why is that important versus, or I guess, yeah, you said just growing your own nitrogen. Why is that important?
Yeah, sure. There's a group of us that believe that the nitrogen that nature makes is better for plants than the stuff we're putting on via synthetic fertilizer. And so, in a typical corn crop rotation, a farmer's going to go to the fertilizer store, buy a bunch of this salty nitrogen, put it on their crops, and hope for the best. That's the way we've been doing it for hundreds of years. I mentioned though that these fertilizers tend to be quite salty, and so salt has a negative detriment on roots, as it does all living species. And so one has to wonder if we can grow the nitrogen organically by using systems nature design. It doesn't bring the salt component with that, and therefore any negative effects that are associated with the application of those salts. So that would be one of what are potentially many reasons. Likewise, if you're going to grow a legume to produce nitrogen, with that would come a unique microbial species that interact with those legumes that may offer benefit for subsequent crops as well. So again, it's probably more complex than we understand, but certainly checks the box that having more diverse populations of microbes beneath our feet is probably a good thing for crops overall. The last thing I'll say there is that if we can economically grow nitrogen via a legume, that might be more cost effective than going to the fertilizer store and buying nitrogen. We know that fertilizer prices swing pretty wildly. Can't control all those variables, but there are certainly scenarios where the cost of synthetic fertilizer is potentially more expensive than what it would cost you to plant a legume and reap the nitrogen out of the natural system.
Now, when talking or whenever you're consulting too, is it primarily cover crops, or is there any other aspects that you are collaborative on?
Sure. So cover crops are a big part of the soil health spectrum that I'm offering farmers. We're also looking at ways to minimize and reduce tillage, and whether or not we can take a system that is in full tillage and convert that to a no-till system without giving up yield. There is a perception amongst those in the farm community that if you convert straight from full tillage to no-till, that you're going to suffer a setback. A setback usually in yield, which of course then translates to dollars at the bottom line. And farmers don't want to make that risk, even if the benefits of no-till are they're convinced that it's a good thing. The opportunity to give up that yield potential by making that switch is not something that they want to have to adopt. So part of the problem here is to figure out how do we manage through this transition. How do you start? Where do you start? How much do you do? What type? Blah blah blah. These are all considerations that need to go into making a transition from full tillage to no-till. So that's certainly something that I'm helping these folks on. And the last thing I'll say in this regenerative arena is figuring out where these biological products fit as well. And so, it's a big, lofty term that means a lot of things to a lot of people. I'll try to summarize it here briefly by saying, these biologicals can take the place of living microorganisms that we put on seed, as I described with the mycorrhizal fungi, plus a whole host of other products that are out there. But there's also natural plant stimulants that come in a jug as well. And so these are also called biologicals. They're not living organisms, but more along the lines of plant extracts, things like humic acids and seaweeds and other naturally derived products that industry has found a way to package and deliver. So coaching clients on which of these products might work for their systems is also a part of the equation. And between those three topics of cover crops, tillage, and biologicals, that really encompasses the bulk of what we're trying to do on the soil health side of things.
Oh, thank you. I would say so. The last question I have to transition a little bit is on the topic of BioCoat Gold. If you can talk about that, because I know you talked about that on John Kim's podcast and how you increased just the yield in corn for the 5 bushel per acre, and yeah, just love to hear that work that you did.
Yeah, sure. I'm certainly happy to do so. I just want to make sure, in full disclosure, I don't sell product. I'm an independent, and so I bring non-biased information. However, what I do is research products that I think work. And if I find products that work, I will recommend these to the farms, and then they can go and chase them down as they see fit. So I just have this strong personal interest in these soil microbes and trying to figure out, where are these products that are on the marketplace? Which ones of these actually going to do work for us? So having reviewed John's product and looking at the label and seeing the ingredients in there and the confidence that there's probably a quality product in this bag, had worked with a couple of producers to try to do this, use this product in various types of strip trials. So for the last 2 or 3 years, what I had done is I had set up what are called split planter trials, where one half of the corn planter has an untreated hybrid of corn. The other half of the planter has been treated with a seed treatment. The farmer takes off down the field and essentially they plant 2 strips, same hybrid, one's treated, one without. We let that plant grow all the way up until yield. We bring a weigh wagon out to the field in the fall. When the combine harvests that, we split that out. We weigh those trials independently, and then we determine if there was any yield separation between those two strips out there. So this can be done in something as small as a 500-foot strip. I say small. Small in my world would be 500 feet, 6 to 8 rows wide. Largest scale trial we did was in a 160-acre field where we had a 40-acre plot of treated seed out there. And in that particular circumstance, that was the one that provided the highest signal for us. For those of you who grow corn or know a few things about corn, we saw a 17 bushel positive response using that AEA BioCoat Gold product. Our belief was that this particular soil this was grown in was deficient in mycorrhizal fungi. And so by using a product that had mycorrhizal fungi in it, it's a pretty straightforward logical assumption to say that there might be a benefit here. And so throughout the growing season, I actually went out and I took a soil sample while the corn plant was still alive that allows us then to measure if mycorrhizal fungi are present. There's a test for that. And so what I found is that in the treated zone where we had the product, there was a 20% higher reading of mycorrhizal fungi in that particular zone relative to the untreated zone. So harkening back to my comment at the beginning of the podcast saying, I just love having these new tools that we can measure things. The ability for us to be able to measure in season whether or not a product is doing what it is saying is a really powerful way for us to help draw conclusions as to whether or not we think these products are doing exactly what they're designed to do. So overall, I was very pleased with that type of research, and that's what led me down this path into believing that mycorrhizal fungi might be the best type of organism to consider for farmers looking at these biological products.
Amazing. Well, thank you. This was such an awesome conversation. If there's any, any last comments or questions, or where the listeners could find you, now would be the good time to share that.
Yeah, thank you for giving me a platform to do this. I really enjoyed the conversation as well. This whole regenerative agriculture movement, I think, is alive and well. I know it takes many forms and many descriptions. And I guess if you're left wondering what is regenerative agriculture, it's one comment I wanted to make. Monty Bottens runs another great podcast on regenerative agriculture, and his definition has been my favorite one so far: always improving. When you think about the word regenerative, when you think about what it implies, it's taking something from its existing state and trying to improve that to something that you believe is better. So always improving is a very, very straightforward and workable definition for me of what regenerative agriculture is. Now we can split hairs all day long on what that means in the field. You know, are we removing tillage? Are we planting more covers? Are we using biologicals? But the essence is that from a grower or an agricultural independent contractor standpoint is that we are just trying to improve the system as a whole, always trying to take it up to the next notch while doing as much minimal damage to the system as we possibly can. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share that. If folks are interested in following me, I'm most active on the Facebooks. You can find me at Ailts Agronomy, and also active on the X platform under the same handle, Ailts Agronomy. So with that, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate being on here today.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure to tag all that in the show notes. Thank you, Joe.
You're welcome.
Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.